All right, I think we're live. Hello everybody. I'm Jarrett Grove. It's the first class, so I thought I would tell you a little bit about who I am, why I structured the class the way that I did, and then I was kind of hoping that everybody in the class could introduce themselves. This is the first time I've ever taught online, so it's a little bizarre talking to a small strip of bobbing heads. Or in this case, really like intense stares over here, just right there. Yeah, you know who you are. Um, I'm Jairus. I teach at the University of Hawaii. I'm actually the director for the Hawaii Center for Future Studies, which is a somewhat unique program. There are, maybe like 30 or 40 future centers in the world. Most futurists are shills for corporations or work for militaries. Hawaii Center is a somewhat unique future center in that it's a future for alternative futures. And so what we do is actually the opposite of what most folks do, in that we try to show the way that forecasting and other kind of quantitative or positivist approaches to futures not only don't predict the future, but are ways to try to lock in particular forms of governance, particular models of economics, and crowd out other kinds of alternatives. So the sort of rule of thumb around here is that anything useful about the future should seem utterly ridiculous. Because if it isn't utterly ridiculous, then it actually isn't something interesting about the future because it's something you already knew, and it's something that already made sense to you. And so mostly what we're interested in is trying to get at this problem of sense, and the way that the problem of sense constrains political thinking and, in particular, political invention. So we do everything from help people design new governments, help people figure out how they're going to manage land practices for the next 1,000 years, what they're going to do if they decide to become, machines, et cetera, et cetera. And we work closely here with a program called the Hawaii Center for Indigenous Politics, which is actually a big part of what goes on here. And we're trying to work on indigenous futures and Afro futures and other ways to consider the future. My background is actually not in futures. I'm an international relations scholar by training. I went to Johns Hopkins University, which is, I think, more known for political theory and international relations than anything else. And so I have kind of a background in security, and I actually do still a fair amount of what you might think of as practitioner work in that field. So in addition to thinking about weird Frankenstein experiments from the 1960s and reading a bunch of continental philosophy, I spent a lot of last week with people who are in the middle of secret negotiations with North Korea, trying to figure out how to get them to not blow up the world for fun. And so I lately have been spending a lot of time with the South Korean government, as well as a lot of retired American government folks that do what's called track 2 diplomacy, which is informal diplomacy when states either hate each other too much or can't work things out enough to have sort of more state-to-state diplomacy. So I try to live in a lot of different worlds, which is, I think, in some ways easier because I do futures work. So there's something about the future which is maybe non-threatening in a kind of unusual way. So that's, part of the reason why I think I can maybe do all of them together. Most of my research is actually also in security studies, although it's on what I often call speculative security studies. So it's trying to think about the way that politics of security will change over the next 40, 50, or even 100 years. For those of you who had a chance to actually read the chapter that I sent out that was by me for today, that was an early part of the research on the actual practical effects that things like cybernetics and neuroscience had on thinking about not just torture, but on what constitutes the political and the human. So that's me in a nutshell. It's most of what I do. I'm generally either with weird people who are trying to reinvent the human race over the next 100 years, creepy people in the U.S. military or U.S. government who are trying to control the world, or with philosopher types who are trying to rethink it. So maybe we could, I don't really know how to do this in an orderly way. Maybe each person can try to introduce themselves, maybe say one thing about why you decided to take the class, what your research interest is, and then kind of kick it to the next person. I guess I could, this is weird, I could call on you, and that might be easier. So I'll just go in the order of the bar at the bottom, and the first person is Daniel. Daniel, could you say who you are and something?
Yes, hello. How do I pronounce your name? Jairus?
Yes, it's Jairus.
Jairus? Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. Well, I'm a political scientist by formation. I studied in Mexico. Currently, I'm here on vacation, actually, but I live in Texas right now. And well, my main research focus is
Curiosity, where in Texas?
Dallas, Irving, to be precise. Yeah. Well, my main research interest has been basically state theory from the classics, Nikos Poulantzas and so on, Miliband, to the most recent studies in urbanism or urban theory and state formations and so on. So I'm really interested in this course because, I don't know, I like to think, I don't like to think of political science in such strict terms as I was taught in school, as rational choice, liberal political thinking, and so on. I always grew kind of tired of that and bored of that. So I like more critical approaches and more, let's say, big picture approaches of the discipline. I don't consider myself like a political scientist in traditional or mainstream sense. So yeah, that's basically why I'm taking this seminar. I am also doing a certificate here in social and political thought, and well, I'm planning to follow my studies with an MA and a PhD, and yeah, work inside academia maybe.
Cool. Okay, so next on the banner is Jack.
Hi, I'm Jack. I live in New York. I'm also doing the certificate in social political thought at the New Center. My research interests are I just got my MA in Middle Eastern Studies, and my research interests have been for a while the biopolitical, technopolitical. So that's kind of what brought me to this course. Hopefully thinking about some of the questions we delve into, with a focus on the Middle East, I guess. That's it.
Cool. Next I have, is it Leanne?
Yeah, hi, I'm Leanne Tange. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, good. I teach English at University of Houston, Victoria. So I'm in Victoria, Texas. Probably rather be in Dallas, but yeah.
So
I got my.
I lived in Victoria for 3 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Are you serious? Oh my God.
Yeah. I would commute from Victoria to Austin to teach at UT. So I know the Golden Triangle well.
Oh God. Yeah, it's an interesting place.
Yeah.
I've been here a year, just over a year, and I'm Canadian, so this is a culture shock.
Yeah, go back to the other Victoria.
Yeah, that's where I was planning to go, and then I got this job.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm gonna get guns on campus next year, which is gonna be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got my did my PhD in Manchester in the UK, and it basically I've always been interested in. I've come out of the English department, so it's literary theory, but I've been applying it more to cultural critical theory and looking at war on terror in particular, the post-Cold War era, sort of ideologically and culturally speaking. So that's my book. And that was my big piece. But then, since then you've done a lot looking into the state of exception theories and the biopolitical aspects of this new sort of redefined global war. And what else was I going to say about that? I just find it a bit. I'm just kind of stuck in it, and I find it's kind of circular as a discourse. It doesn't, everyone's kind of said everything there is to be said about it, and I just found this chapter here really sort of broke away from that in a useful way for me. So I'm also affiliated with the York Center for International Security Studies in York University, Toronto.
Yeah.
So so I'm getting more. I'm edging back in that direction anyway for security. So I thought this would be a good one.
Cool. Okay, great. Next is it Mari? Marie?
It's just Mary.
Oh,
Mary.
sorry.
Okay.
I think our names are very similar. So it could be either of us.
Oh, there's two Marys. Oh dear God. Okay, Mary Two Eyes is actually
It's
first.
Mari. Yeah,
Mari.
in case that's
Okay.
useful. Yeah. Hi, I'm Mari. I'm an transdisciplinary practice certificate student. And my project for my certificate is kind of surrounding internet.org, which is a global connectivity initiative, mostly coming out of Facebook, but also partnering with Nokia, Qualcomm, etc. And so kind of in a direct sense, I'm really interested in this course in understanding how kind of like planetary consensus is structured. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Cool. Okay, so Mari. Awesome. All right, I'm on it. So next, Mary.
I'm a guest of Jason's today. I go to school at Kendall where Jason also teaches. So impress me.
Okay.
Basically, she's trying it out and getting a sense of what we do here at the New Center and potentially this class too.
Sure. Okay. I'm happy to be tested. The next person doesn't actually have oh, Matthew. There we go. I think you have to unmute yourself, Matthew.
Hi, yeah, I'm Matthew. So I'm in Los Angeles, and I'm doing certificate in the transdisciplinary research as well. And I'm interested in studying the conceptualization of stress through body politics, biopolitics, geopolitics, etc. Yeah, I'm excited about the futuristic aspect of this for sure.
Cool. Yeah, I'm always interested in anxiety. And then the next one, it just says the New Center, so I'm assuming that's Jason. We can ignore him for the moment. The next one is Thomas. Thomas?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, hi, I'm Thomas Elliott, and I am a certificate student in social political theory at the New Center. And I'm a graduate student in philosophy at Eastern Michigan University, and I guess my major research interests are in things like deconstruction and communism and I don't know, contemporary critical theory, that sort of thing. So what interests me in this class? Well, I'm sort of I don't know, I would call myself broadly an eschatological thinker. I'm definitely very apocalyptic in my outlook, and anything to do with the future and how it is horrifying, I'm right there. So that and Jason asked me to be in here, so that's it.
Cool. Yeah, well, yeah. The end is nigh, for sure. Okay, cool. All right, well...
yeah.
I think there's one more person. I think we missed Gianni.
Is there?
Yeah, you missed me.
Oh, hey, Gianni. Sorry,
Hi,
you popped up without a picture. Are you still there?
I'm still here, yeah.
Okay. Could you introduce yourself?
Okay.
Are you able
Hi,
to? Are you able to turn on your camera or no?
I don't mind looking at a flashing generic.
I mean,
general
it's just
head,
you.
that's fine.
I'll pull it up in a minute, yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me anyway, just for now?
Yeah. The circle gets bigger as the intensity of your voice increases. It's not
Okay, I'm
color like a cuttlefish.
right. My name is Gianni Wise, as the Italian. I'm from Sydney, Australia, and I'm currently finishing in my PhD. It's basically on the construction of unreasonable fear and paranoia. So that's the general sort of gamut of it. I've just attended a whole series of intensive workshops at EGS, European Graduate School, under Warren Needish, if you know this guy. Neuroplasticity, new power, that sort of thing, biopolitical power. And what I'm kind of fascinated at the moment is in the area of network aesthetics. I'm a practicing visual artist for quite a while. So I'm kind of interested in that interface of the aesthetic of networks, yeah, which is a fascination for me. Of course, it's grounded in the areas a lot of people talk about here, is the state of exception, neuroplasticity, and that sort of thing. I was fascinated in some other forms that have developed in terms of working. Unmonastery, I've heard about that group. I'm not sure if you heard about those guys. So I walked into this group literally 24 hours ago, so I'm sort of framing and catching up my position, but that's fascinating anyway. It may be part of the last chapter. Who knows?
Great. Where are you working at Sydney?
University of Sydney.
What department?
Okay, it's in the School of Fine Arts there. So I cross over between fine arts and politics. So it sits between the two schools,
okay.
really. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a long-term research project with the Center for International Security there. So James Verdering and I sort of trade places. So I'm in Sydney about twice a year.
Okay. Drop in sometime.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I will say, I thought I would talk a little bit about why horror, and also what I'm up to for the class, which, given almost everyone has mentioned the term biopolitics, I think would maybe not be a bad place to start. And that I'm trying to think about what biopolitics doesn't capture in terms of the confluence between life and politics. So what happens in some sense when the character and diversity of life exceeds the sort of simpler metric of productivity, right, or normality, and becomes instead, as Liz said in the control studies essay, a problem of modulation, right, or steering in the cybernetic sense, as opposed to a sort of simpler binomial notion of good or bad. But I wanted to actually start with why horror, because I think this is a little bit unusual for me, in that I'm actually not terribly interested in cultural theory, theories of representation, questions of discourse. Not because I think that they're not useful. I think in part it's because I don't particularly like humans all that much, and humans are really excited about the fact that they can use language. They're totally fascinated with themselves. And part of it is also that while I think that discourse is an essential and important part about what constitutes the political and something that we often call the social, I think it is, as Wittgenstein said, like the meniscus on water, right? It is the absolute thinnest part of the extraordinary depths, which constitute everything from affects to human, non-human relations to other kinds of orders and processes that far exceed kind of our jurisdiction and control, and the way that those then feed back into the systems that we do think we have access to. And so I think part of the problem of language is that it tends to, ahead of time, already constrain what it is we can ask as a question. I mean, in part because we have this, even though we're all good post-Kantians, we still have this sort of Kantian idea that the world is mere appearance, and right, we make judgments upon those appearances, and so we tend to constrain cognition and thought within that world of appearance. And for me, we experience and feel vastly more than we can know. And so if that's true, then what I'm interested in is how to develop modes of inquiry that are not precisely knowledge. And so I've been working a lot with this idea that Bataille came to at the sort of end of his life, which he called non-knowledge, which is the vast number of provocations in life which don't live up to the standards of epistemology. And so the example he uses sounds actually like the beginning of a really terrible joke, but basically he was coming out of this conference, and of all things, because this happened in the 50s, he bumped into Merleau-Ponty and the really boring British philosopher A.J. Ayer, and a mutual friend of theirs who was a doctor, and they were like, oh, we should all go get a drink. And so a phenomenologist, whatever the hell you want to call Bataille, Anglo-empiricist, and a doctor walk into a bar. And of course, the first thing that they ask is, a bunch of series of philosophical questions to see where they all stand on things. And the question, I don't remember who brought it up, I think Ayer, was whether or not the sun existed before humans. And they all universally said no. Then Merleau-Ponty changed. He's like, yes, maybe. But the problem they had is that from the position in which they thought about knowledge, right, by definition, one couldn't say that the sun existed before humans because there would be no idea of the sun before humans, because humans were the only measure of what we mean by knowledge. And Bataille takes this as sort of a jumping off point because he thinks that epistemologically that's accurate. But of course it's totally absurd to say that the sun didn't exist before humans. Right? Obviously the sun is the condition of possibility whereby life emerges on the planet and humans exist on the planet. And so either we have to say that we need some kind of impossible epistemology which allows for a kind of anthropomorphism of the sun before humans could conceive of it, or we need to just admit that the vast amount of the stuff that really interests us is non-knowledge, right? That is sort of broken and doesn't live up to the standards that we think of as evidence or data or an idea. And for me, this is fundamentally connected to this idea of horror. So when I say horror, I'm not interested in a kind of like cultural studies approach of, what do horror movies teach us about the world, or what are the representational practices of horror films, and I think that's all really cool stuff. But what I mean is, and sometimes I will talk about horror movies, but more what is metaphysical horror? Meaning, what does it mean to come into contact with a series of provocations which are deeply older or different than us, and nonetheless cross over into the world and provoke us. And the reason why I think that's horrifying is that it constantly reminds us that the world isn't ours, that we are not sort of, that the world isn't meant for us. And I'll get a little bit more into what I think that means for neuropolitics, but I think that becomes increasingly horrifying when we realize that most of what we mean by cognition, most of what we mean by the body, is also not for us in the sense of knowledge, right? We are provoked by it, we experience it precisely as something we can't know. And I think there is something deeply alienating about coming to grips with the fact that who we are is not us. Right? Does that make sense? So, to use an example from film, right after I said I don't really care about films or movies, there's a great scene in the X-Files remake of From the Mountains of Madness, where they're like trapped in this Arctic place, and there's this horrible black goo that's getting into them and taking over their brains, and they find scrawled on a wall in blood, because that was all that was available to write in. Reality is dramatic and even melodramatic. It says, "We are not us." It's a great phrase, right? Because how do we already constitute a we, right? Because we have to speak from a position, and also at the same time have a sense that the we is not us, right? That we are not in some sense, identical with the thing that speaks. For me, that captures truly what horror is, which is the pragmatic necessity to have to speak as an I or a we, and at the same time, the inability to fully make sense of what that I or we is. And then when we get to the question of torture, or even worse, the possibility that the condition of possibility for the I or we is not just beyond our control, but in some sense can betray us, right? That we can be betrayed by our own bodies, that we can be betrayed by our own brains. And in a large part, this is why, I'm interested in Catherine Malibu's work. Her sort of example that she comes back to over and over again is the example of Alzheimer's, right? Which is a terrifying disease, not because it's like Ebola where you bleed out your eyes or some other thing that devours you from within, but precisely because you lose the ability to recognize yourself and others, right? Your brain, right? The thing that you consider sort of most intimate actually begins to leave you, right? To betray you. And so this opens up this whole question of something like horror as a category of experience, but not a category of knowledge. And so what I want is horror, not just as a category of experience, but to go one step further and really push towards knowledge, even though we can't have it, and say that horror is a category of inquiry. It's a particular way at coming at questions, right, which is first and foremost radically anti-humanist, meaning that the questions we are asking are not convenient for our particular form of species being. Second, that as a mode of inquiry, it's extraordinarily messy, right? It won't conform to any particular one metaphysics or epistemology, which we can make rational in such a way that we could capture all the ideas that we want. And three, that it's always on the verge of falling apart. That part of what's necessary about these questions is having to take seriously the fact that horror is horrifying precisely because it confronts us with a world that, because it doesn't care about us, can just decide that we don't matter anymore at any minute. And that scales, cosmologically all the way down, right? That it's just as much a betrayal when, an enormous black hole swallows the Earth and we say, but wait, we matter. And it says nothing. All the way to when the person that's supposed to protect you most, right, the people who take an oath of duty to defend our national security, decide that they want to see how far inside your brain they can get. That all of these confront us with the fact that the world and reality is itself horrifying. Horrifying is not a cultural aesthetics for making the world weird. The world is already weird. And those things that we think are sacred or inviolable, unfortunately, are not. That we are, in fact, working truly without a net. There is no point at which reality will come back and say, no, 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 that's too truly disgusting, violent, terrifying, awful. That won't happen. So you can't do that. As if, and I think this is true of most moral philosophy, as if somewhere in the physical laws was also a boundary between what you should and should not be able to do. Okay, so that's why horror. Why horror? Because I think it's a particular way of going about inquiry that takes for granted that human cognition, human thinking will not be capable of exhausting what counts as a provocation in the form of knowledge. The second reason is actually a little bit closer to cultural theory, which is that I think that horror as a genre, and I actually mean a genre of reality, not as a kind of genre of film or literature, but a genre of reality that becomes reflected in film and literature, helps prepare us for a set of questions and inquiries that otherwise seem absurd. So one of the problems with doing research on the origins of what I call neo or neuro torture is that even when you find the evidence of it, even when Congress holds hearings about it, in fact, and actually puts on full display that we experiment on people's brains. We experiment with mind control. We invest millions and millions of dollars in producing what seems like sci-fi. Even when it's actually on C-SPAN, somehow people are incapable of taking it in as knowledge, right? So even when it exists as what we could actually call knowledge, right, it follows a certain kind of rational pattern. It has particular kinds of datum which show it to be real. We have a consensus on what those words mean that are representing that data. It still doesn't seem real, right? In fact, you know, despite the declassification, it's not in any way a political problem. In fact, the declassification of the CIA torture memos has so far had almost no consequence at all. And so I think taking on horror as a mode of inquiry helps prepare us to not experience shock in such a way of horror, such that we dismiss these things as, you know, conspiracy theory or as, you know, just sort of the ramblings of people on the left. So that brings us to the why security, and in part that's just because that's, you know, that's my playground. That's where I play and think and research. It's also because I think there's a moment in the 1950s and 60s in which security actually takes up a number of philosophical problems and puts them to the task of experimentation. And those are two related concepts for me, which are an essential part of the class, which is this relationship between security, which we normally think of as a kind of policing technique. At least that's the kind of origin that Foucault gives it in Security, Territory, and Population. It's about creating an order, right, which is functional, right, which allows for economies to thrive, for the cities to work smoothly. And something about security changes in the 1940s and 50s, and instead becomes about inventing new kinds of order, right? It actually begins a process where, rather than in the kind of what I call a Machiavellian dialectic, right, trying to balance fear and love, right, as a form of political persuasion, whereby you create people who will consent to be governed, security in the 1940s and 50s tries to think about how to invent a population which is already governed, right, baked into the constitution of what it is to be a population, which for me is a very different shift from biopolitics, right? If biopolitics takes a series of problems of deviance, productivity, normality, various kinds of bodies and their resistances, and tries to organize them at the scale of the population towards a particular conception of the good, or at least, you know, a particular conception of governmentality, right, how they are to be governed, this model of a kind of politics of life and a politics of the brain actually doesn't know ahead of time what it wants the population to be. And it enters a kind of permanent experimental phase. In some ways, the way that I've thought about this, you know, there's this Spinozist phrase that Gilles Deleuze loves, that we know not yet what a body can do. And for me, security politics, particularly in the United States, but also in the UK and Japan and China, took the Spinozist question seriously, but in the key of horror. That what they wanted to know was what a body could do. And the way that they sought to find that out was through a series of neurological experiments, neurochemical experiments, training experiments, experiments with pain and torture, experiments with training, with various kinds of what they called strategic communications, so taking propaganda to kind of the next scale, and that these practices of security did not fit the traditional practice of security because they were often indifferent to the question of whether or not they produced order. And so one of the things which I think often takes us off guard when we take on security from a biopolitical perspective is that we tend to see things like, for instance, the invasion of Iraq in 2002, or the various ways in which we prepare for violence, or rather in 2003, or in Afghanistan, as being failures, right? Because they didn't produce the order we said we were looking for. They didn't produce good biopolitical polities. But if one takes a different perspective, that security politics from the 1940s and 50s forward is a process of experimentation, and that disorder can also be productive from an experimental perspective, then we ought not think of those invasions in the traditional paradigm of the kind of Noam Chomsky left, where we say, oh, look how destructive and failed neoconservative nation building is. And instead start to ask questions of whether or not neoconservative nation building actually was doing precisely what it wanted, right? If it was looking for ways in which to experiment with whole populations, right, just to see what they might do. And so for me, that actually doesn't accord with what people like Michael Dillon have called the liberal way of war, right? Sort of biopolitics at war. It doesn't disprove it, right? But it means that in parallel to those formulations of war and order making, there may be this other sort of experimental or beta phase approach to power, violence, and intervention, which often confounds it, challenges it, and produces very different kinds of bodies. Such that it's not exactly clear that the weird morphing that happens where, you know, the mujahideen get developed against, you know, say for instance the Soviet Union and Afghanistan in the 1980s, and then morph again and become what's called les Afghans, right, and become involved in African civil wars, and then train and become parts of what are then to become Al-Qaeda, and then transform again and become parts of ISIS. But those, in some sense, are blowback, the way that the left would like to think them, but are instead part of exactly what experimental orders do, which is they let things go into the wild just to see what might happen. And while that's speculative and conspiratorial, I'm not interested whether or not neoconservatives, either early on during the 80s or sort of later during the second Bush administration, were intending to do that, but instead to say that once security starts to treat both the individual and the world as a laboratory, that we ought not be surprised that we let go upon populations mutational machines, right? Mutational effects, which can produce everything from mind control to new organizations of political violence. So that's what I'm up to. I don't have any idea what to call it yet. I don't know what we call this intervention into forms of life and interventions into neuropolitics. It's not biopolitics, but I want to leave open a space that says, let's not call this biopolitics just yet, because I don't think the governance over life and death quite captures what it means to experiment with the very matter which constitutes what is life, right? A kind of molecularization of interventions, but one that's not oriented around a particular telos, right? Sometimes not even the telos of capitalism, which is predominantly how Foucault understood biopolitics. Sometimes just around the telos of curiosity, that sometimes we do things and we know not why. And I actually think that when we get to the CIA training manual, and then look at the actual CIA report, you'll find that things that happened at the Cobalt prison that was built were actually not planned. They just wanted to see what they could do to a human being. And that kind of experimental curiosity is actually exactly what I mean by horror. That there isn't some little Immanuel Kant inside every one of us that like calls the categorical imperative and it's like, don't do that. That's not a maxim. It's not universal. That there is actually sort of nothing to stop us from entering precisely into those areas and territories which we think are most sacred. So that's what I'm up to. That's what I think the class is about. I'm hoping we can kind of work together to think about what those new theoretical terrains are, where we think that theorization that's already happened is insufficient for capturing those problems. In the case of state theory, which a lot of people are interested in, what that means about perverse and differential versions of governmentality which don't follow the processes of rationalization that we normally think of as governmentality. There's this phrase I really like. This guy Jeff Vandermeer, who wrote the Southern Reach trilogy, sort of a novelist of the new weird. He's described the Department of Defense as having a aspic bureaucracy. The sort of aspic is that creepy, fatty stuff like gelatin that floats to the top of something that has meat into it. That's sort of clear. There's this sort of like fatty, greasy sheen all over the Department of Defense. We don't know quite what it is, but it like kind of holds things together. And so I want to try to give a name to that experimental, horrifying, greasy sheen, which is providing a certain kind of insight into security politics, but isn't reducible to strategic interests and the normal ways in which we conceive of order. So that's about 20 minutes of spiel. I kind of thought people could ask questions a bit, and then we could transition into the readings. I know a lot of people got them kind of late, so they may not have gotten into them, but we could at least kind of talk about some of the key terms in the readings. Why neuroscience? How are we thinking about the human differently? Some of the big questions, and then we can go from there. Who wants to go first? Not all.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You can hear me?
I can, but you should say who you are, since like the visualization of this is sort of not ideal.
I'm Jack. But I think if you click off your screen, then I'll come up big.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah.
Big.
So I guess my question is, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about why you think that what we're seeing now beyond the biopolitical is not just a return to the relationship between ruler and ruled that's right over life and death, and why it's completely different than that as well.
That's a good question. For starters, because I'm interested in when these events particularly take place in what we might call non-sovereign spaces. So I mean, we could play a game, right, where there's a kind of infinite regress and sovereignty reinscribes itself, all the way down from Obama to the particular torturer who does this thing. I think that would be fine, and I think you could make that kind of claim. But the problem with that is that I don't actually think that captures the creative element here, right? Part of what I want to do is to have a kind of, horrifying theory of creativity. Here's why I think this matters. So if we wanted to give a sovereign reading, right, we want to think about this as ruler and ruled. Then when a particular neuro-torturer is seeing the limits of a body locked in Guantanamo, then what they're doing is kind of habituating the relationship, right? Like a kind of subordination between the sovereign right of the torturer and the kind of supplicant nature of the tortured. But that's a very small part of it. In fact, actually quite the opposite, right? Like oftentimes the form of torture, right, that a particular event of torture resembles is one of abandonment, of desertion, right, where one withdraws from not just the room, but actually withdraws all forms of experience from the person being tortured, right? Darkness, gets the temperature just right so they can't feel their own skin, blocks out even a sort of experience of bodily noise, right? So creates white noise such that you can't hear your own body. And in those moments, actually, it runs quite contrary to what we might call a sovereign decision, because it actually unmakes the subject that would be governed. And it doesn't do it for a particular purpose, right? So, even if we take a pretty narrow kind of Schmittian reading of what sovereignty is, right, the sovereign decision is a way that you mark the political, right? It marks both the friend and the enemy, but it also delimits what is and isn't political, what is a particular form of life versus a different form of life. Whereas these processes are actually processes of pretty radical deterritorialization, right? They're trying to see what happens when all the demarcations start to fall apart and disappear. And so I think it's not to say that those aren't inscribed in particular kinds of sovereign orders, because obviously, right, Guantanamo is the state of exception par excellence, right? It's the space which is marked off as being kind of a zone of exception as well as a legal order of exception. And then the actual, right, geography of being an island contributes to that. But what takes place in that space isn't, in some sense, path dependent on that sovereign exception. Does that make sense? Right, and so, right, if we only described it as a sort of zone of exception, then all we could say about it, like Agamben does of the neomorts in Homo Sacer Part 1, is that we can suspend, right, the right to life. But in these cases, it's not about like life or death. It's about what can we make life do. What are the limits and capacities of life, right? How can we intensify them in particular ways? And I think actually as we go on in the seminar, you'll see that actually doesn't just happen in the torture chamber. That actually starts to happen even with big systems like air power, for instance, right? We start to rethink U.S. air power, not on the particular strategic significance of what we blow up, but the semiotics of what happens when we blow something up, right? Like, how does it persuade a population? How does it alter their cognitive capacity, right? So we even try to scale up these conceptions further and further and further. And for me, that sort of slips by sovereignty in that it's playing with the human at a scale for which the sovereign subject is not, in some sense, the main target of the particular, either decisions or relations of power. I don't know, is that helpful at all? Yeah. Yes.
I have a question too. So in that sense of interfering with something that isn't the, let's say, sovereign subject or individual anymore, on the other side, would you say or consider that there's something like a political economy of this kind of new forms of, let's say, I don't know, neurotorture or I don't know how to call it, if there's not an underlying logic, but a kind of, set of objectives that guide these kinds of experimentations, that obey to a wide set of, let's say, rules of social reproduction or of power logics and so on?
That's a great question. I think that one would want to think about scales and phases of experimentation. Actually, in very similar ways to the way something like product design and marketing research takes place. So there's no coincidence that it's Edward Bernays' work on shaping public opinion in like 1917, 1919, and the work that he does in marketing gets picked up both in political science and in marketing, right? And part of Bernays' question in how we manufacture consent is how do we shape publics, right? Rather than how to like spin ourselves for them, right? Presuming the public has a series of kind of values, positions, and how do we make ourselves kind of more marketable to them? How do we shape the public so the thing that we want to market is marketable to them? So here I'll give you an example. So I think part of what I want to get at is that when someone like DARPA starts doing research on brain implants or some of these neurotorture techniques start getting used, they're what in science we'd call pure research, meaning they actually don't have objectives in every case. Sometimes they really are truly experimental, right? But then they enter what in Silicon Valley we'd call a beta phase, right, where the insight from the pure experimentation is sort of adapted into something like a commodity, right, or a product or an app. And so an example would be, well, we get these insights from someone like Bernays that we can shape populations in particular ways through the way that we market ideas to them. So let's take that on the road, and then we try it out on a population, right? We sort of we market test it. We do the sort of the equivalent of focus groups. And often that's in another country, right? So we try strategic communications in Iraq, or we try strategic, communications. And actually, one of the very first places we ever did it was in Iran before the revolution, right? So the example, rather than just overthrowing Mossadegh, who was the constitutional presidentially elected president of Iran in '52, which we tried once, right? So we tried to get Mossadegh out of power in Iran, I guess in '51, '52, through a traditional coup. We get a bunch of military people to come in, arrest him, put him in jail. That doesn't work. There's a national strike. They break him out of jail. He gets back into power. He's more powerful than ever. So the second time around, the CIA and this guy named Kermit Roosevelt, who was actually related to Theodore Roosevelt, says, let's try something different. Let's not take him out of power. Let's create supporters for him. And MI6, because the British are involved too, think this is crazy. They're like, why would we want to create support for him? And he said, well, let's create the wrong kind of support for him. So they actually produced a group of explicit communist, outspoken supporters for Mossadegh. Why? Because Iran was really ambivalent about communism, because Russia was also an imperial force in Iran, because it would make Americans who were actually pretty well disposed towards Mossadegh, they thought he was actually a pretty good leader, really suspicious of him. And so they started putting on, like, basically what amounts to performance art, right? The protests in favor of Mossadegh by communists, right? Such that they actually steer the impressions and the way that people view Mossadegh away from the kind of nationalist discourse which he was using to frame himself and the many others towards a discourse of communism, as if, right, that weren't something that could be measured by reality, but that was something that could actually be altered, right? At that point in time, when we enter that beta phase, right, then I think there's something like a political economy or a political ecology, in that it's the kind of weaponization or instrumentalization of the pure research. But I don't think that we should read back into the pure research that it always already had a telos, because then I think we miss that there are particular logics of experimentation which are not self-identical with logics of politics or order. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? Yep. I think we lost Daniel.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So going back to Jack's question, and jump in, Jack, if you want. So you're saying that torture is redefining life or subject, and but you're also supposing there are alternative sovereign spaces that were created. Is this correct?
Yeah. So. But they weren't created for the purpose. So there's, I think there's a presumption that the forms of torture that are taking place are themselves instrumental because the decision to create extra sovereign spaces was instrumental. Does that make sense? So I'll give you an example. The black sites that were created throughout Europe were created precisely because, basically, the president didn't want to know what was happening, right? So they were extra sovereign in the sense that the sovereign order was both suspended in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of governance, right? So the CIA that would be doing torturing in these spaces were kind of delegated, not authority, but delegated invisibility, right? Which is different than delegating authority. It's not the president saying, do this on my behalf. It's saying, enter this space for which I cannot know, such that you have freedom, right, to do this thing that I won't know about. Now, that was done ostensibly to do these like Jack Bauer-esque 24 torture scenes, right, where we'd get someone who really knew something, and we would use whatever means necessary to extract that data from them, such that that data could be used for strategic interests. Now, that's actually the form of torture that we've debated about the most, historically speaking, right? Torture used, and that's the argument for it, right? Oh, well, if we hadn't tortured this person, we would have never found Osama bin Laden. Or if we hadn't tortured this person, a nuclear bomb would have gone off in downtown New York, right? The kind of ticking time bomb scenario. And that may be true. There may have been instances of torture in which the primary goal was to extract something from the person being tortured. But the reality is, empirically speaking, the majority of torture that took place used techniques which explicitly were known to erase minds, meaning to make it incapable of telling what was a hallucination and what was true. Made it possible for people to actually forget who they were. Made it possible for people to mistake hallucinations for reality. Now, if the goal was extracting information, then there's no reason we should have used those torture techniques, right? Right? You don't want to basically reformat somebody's brain if you're trying to get information from them. And so those experimental techniques have to have some other reason, right? They either fall into like a kind of classical model of torture that Foucault talks about at the beginning of Discipline and Punish, where the torture is torture for its own sake, right? It's like the saving grace of pain. Or since it can't fall into the second one, which is it's supposed to, you know, reform, redeem, or get information from them, then it could be this third thing, which is we just wanted to see what certain forms of torture could do, right? Could they make someone think they were someone else? Could we replace somebody's identity or personality with a different identity and personality? Could we break someone to the point at which they would accept anything, right? They would do whatever we asked and think that they wanted to. Does that make sense? So the sovereign reading of that doesn't actually track very well.
So there actually are reasons for why in these experimental techniques they are experimenting. So they are experimenting to see what they can find, but also it's an experimental body that is just running to experiment simultaneously.
Except in most cases the experimental experimentation, as opposed to the instrumental torture, they actually interfere with one another. So just to use an example, you know, one of the people tortured at Cobalt, basically within a day, started having intense hallucinations that he was being eaten by dogs. And it was the result of having been deprived of all other sensory experience. His body actually started creating new sensory experiences. And we can talk about Lily in a minute, but if Lily's accurate, then like if you put this person on a PET scan, their brain would light up the same way as if they were actually being eaten by dogs. And in another case, someone thought they had actually died, right? They had the experience of death. And they didn't know who they were. They had severe amnesia afterwards. If those things really took place, then you would never want to do those things to try to get intel, right? Because you wouldn't be able to trust the intelligence at all, right? You have someone who can't distinguish, quote unquote, between their internal and external reality any longer. And so, you know, in the case of the person who thought he was being eaten by dogs, that continued for another 11 months. So why would you continue doing something for 11 months that was definitionally destroying anything that could be knowledge, and also well beyond anything where like the expiration date on knowledge could be valuable? Does that make sense, right? We continued these experiments in some cases for years, well beyond any conception that what they once knew could still be relevant.
So you're proposing that it's almost like cancer cells that take over a body autonomously of the body, in a way, like the CIA is working in a rogue state autonomously of the ruler, and are basically taking over these people without any kind of restraint or even goal.
I don't want to go to the extreme of without any restraint, right? It's more that a looseness develops within the sovereign order, right? And this starts early on, but when science and experimentation becomes kind of an essential part of what security means, that something like another order of jurisdiction, another order or a different logic of power and authority is able to coexist, right? And in some cases symbiotically with sovereignty. But it is not reducible to the sovereign order. And in some ways, I think that the way, you know, the other way to think about that is people are given a kind of free hand because there's a sense that innovation will occur in the looseness of this other order. Does that make sense? So yeah, so I'm not trying to throw out the concept of sovereignty or even the concept of the zone of exception, but the problem is when it becomes too rigid, right? When it becomes too structural a model of understanding, right, where authority and power function, then I think we lose the fact that there are these kind of, you could call them rogue or we could call them nomad, right? That there are tinkerer sciences and nomad sciences even within the kind of state system, which do things which do not accord to the logics of biopolitics or sovereign politics.
Would you find a relationship between, let's say, what has been recently called the government of the precarious? I mean, governmentality through precariousness in neoliberal countries, especially in the third world, and this kind of approach you're trying to make? I don't know. Would you see any relationship between them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a relationship. Let me think about this for a second. So when someone like Judith Butler tries to extend this concept of precarity, or someone like Joao Biel, right, in Vita, who tries to think about this new governmentality of precarity, right? He's talking about this woman, right, who he calls Vita, right, for whom she's faced experimentation. She's kind of been through every different kind of institution, so much so that because of schizophrenia and multiple medications, she's not even really sure who she is anymore. And so he wants to, like someone like Elizabeth Pavanelli, think about biopolitics as an affirmative management of abandonment, which is different than thinking about like the evacuation of a sovereign order, right? Because in one, right, if it was just like the removal of the state, which is how a lot of globalization theorists talked about kind of the withdrawal or withering of the state in the 90s, then these zones of abandonment would just be kind of zones of freedom. Or they would be zones of exception in the sense of exteriority. But I think part of what someone like Pavanelli or Biel are trying to say is that actually they're internalized, right, forms of abandonment, right? They are actually part of the governmentalized order. So in the case of Pavanelli, when she thinks about the way that Aborigines are governed through deprivation, right, in Australia, that doesn't mean that they're cut off from the sovereign system, right? They're included, but they're included through an affirmative management of abandonment. Now, I think that in instances of abandonment, that experimentation tends to take place more frequently, right? So it's not uncommon, right? You know, you can even think back in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. There's a scene where basically he's experiencing electroshock therapy. He's in an asylum. It's unclear what's happening to him. And the reason why it could happen is because he was poor and black, right? He was vulnerable in a certain sense. Similarly, right, I think that, right, experimentation is not, the kind of experimentation I'm talking about is not an equal opportunity experimentalism, right? We don't find out that rich kids from Williamsburg suddenly disappear and have had their minds wiped, right? There are structures that are the reason why the majority of people who experience this kind of neurotorture are people who have had their legal designations changed, right, as enemy combatants or as sort of quasi-prisoners of war or as persons of interest, right? And there's a reason why persons of interest in these cases are predominantly either coded as Islamic, as Arabic, right? There are all these ways in which we racialize those processes. So I think that at some level the intensification of precariousness has expanded the numbers of populations and the numbers within populations that will experience this form of experimentation. Does that make sense? Right. So the magnitude is intensifying both geographically and within geographies, sort of vertically in terms of the number that will be included. However, what I don't want to do is say that there is a process of dehumanization. And this is something which I try to insist upon in the essay about Malibu. The logic of dehumanization assumes that the reason we think we can, that the United States thinks that it can do these things to, say, someone picked up in Afghanistan, is that someone in Afghanistan is not fully human, right? That they've been objectified or animalized or reduced in some way to fall outside the circle of the anthropos. I understand the value of that polemical response, but I actually think that that logic is extraordinarily dangerous because it presumes that in some sense the moral character of the people doing the torturing would only be capable of doing the torturing so long as they truly believed the ones they were torturing were less than human. Right? For me, the key of horror is assuming that the people doing the torturing might not even be racists. That they may fully understand and know the Afghani prisoner of war as fully human, right? As being an equal. And that that relationship of equality may be insufficient as a kind of categorical imperative against the horrifying practices that they then engage in. That in some ways, the whole logic of dehumanization is a kind of liberal alibi. Because what it wants to do is provide an explanation for why, it's not the human that's fucked, right? It's the fact that we're not human enough, right? So if we could just restore everyone to humanity, everything would be okay. For me, in a kind of like almost anti-Arendtian way, I want to say that, this problem may not be a problem that goes away with racism and kind of civilizational politics. We may precisely, right, humanity may not itself be a guard against these kinds of practices. Because I don't think that that this is being done because Afghanis are thought of as being inferior. It's precisely being done because we think that Afghanis are human and what we learn will be broadly applicable. And so there's kind of a new cosmopolitanism, right, a dark cosmopolitanism at the heart of experimentation, which thinks, yes, we're all human, which is why we can experiment on you and learn something about the college kid in Iowa. Right? This is the same kind of dark cosmopolitanism that says we can do pharmaceutical trials in poor areas in Africa where we won't be sued for killing a bunch of people when the drug doesn't work. But the knowledge that we gain from that experimentation will be just as useful for the new erectile dysfunction drug we killed, a bunch of people in Rwanda with when we sell it to people in Illinois. Right? Does that make sense? So I don't want to give in to this idea that this is merely a kind of like horrific edge to racism or to kind of Orientalism. I want to actually think about it as a new universalism, just a dark universalism.
That's really, really helpful. Thanks.
Anybody else got some ideas?
I have another question.
Yeah.
Hey,
Jack, before you ask another question, so in a classroom I can kind of tell, but here it's a little hard. I want to let the uncomfortable silence sit a little bit to see if anybody who hasn't asked a question yet is gonna perk up. So hold for just a second, Jack.
Hello?
Yeah?
God, you might be, I mean, this might be some of the most frightening contemporary thinking that I'm aware of at all. Do you have a text? I mean, like a substantive text, a book?
The book doesn't come out until next year. The slowness of academic publications. But yeah, I got bits and pieces. You're welcome to look at stuff. So there's one manuscript that's actually what's sorry.
It just is amazing to me. I mean, all of the different. I don't know that I have a question exactly. I just want to hear more. I mean, I read the CIA torture report with some relish. It was, and what you were saying about how it's not that we're dehumanizing them, but that specifically that it is because they're human that it'll be applicable everywhere. I mean, it's just so stark and horrifying. It's amazing. I mean, where does it go from here? How? I mean, just how dark is it? And just out of pure experimentation, has any regime in history ever resembled this before? I mean, this goes well beyond. It strikes me. I mean, the Nazis were so crude in comparison. It seems. Is there any precedent for this kind of horror?
Well, the first thing is that for me, horror
Or is it just
starts with the insight that there's no such thing as how dark can it get, right? The only physical limits to darkness are the total absence of light, right? So I actually want to insist on that point. There's no way the world's supposed to be. So part of what you get when you take horror as a mode of inquiry is that if we live in a world without providence, meaning there's no particular way the world is supposed to be, then there is, following that premise, no limit to how life can be organized. So part of the problem for me of liberal thought is it sort of presumes that, well, if things get too bad, right, that there's this sort of meta program in humans, it'll be like, oh shit, right, we got too bad, right, we'll have to turn things back around. And I don't see any reason to believe that. Now, as to whether or not there's a regime that looks this way, I mean, obviously there are aspects of the U.S. regime that look this way, but you know, North Korea is an extraordinary experiment in the degree to which you can manage, steer, and alter the entire production of life. From the fact that, I mean, there is a North Korean internet, right? But the North Korean internet is not part of our internet. There's North Korean TV and filmmaking and everything, and it is entirely around the cult of the Kim family. And so, you know, the thing that shocked me, so I had this intelligence briefing at the South Korean CIA about a month ago. It wasn't top secret or anything, but it was in the creepy, weird war room, and they were showing me all the satellite intel. And you know, the thing that Americans always think, because this is the narrative that we tell ourselves, is that North Korea is going to collapse any minute. Why? Because no one can live under this kind of absolute totalitarian, authoritarian, sort of just total saturation of life. We must be on the brink of collapse. And there was not a South Korean intelligence analyst in the room that thought there was any risk of collapse in South Korea. In fact, they said that despite how crazy we think Kim Jong-un is, he is wildly popular, he's celebrated, that even a decade of famine doesn't seem to have undermined the credibility of the regime at all, and that things more or less are normal, right? They're normal for North Korea. And so part of what I'm looking at when I'm thinking about plasticity, not just about neuroplasticity, but the plasticity of a polity, right, of a political order, is that there may be no limit to what can become normal. And that's something that runs very contrary to the liberal tradition, right, which presumes that there'll be something which will happen, like Nazism, right, where we'll say, oh, dear God, no, that can't become normal. But for me, you know, and this is some of reading like Afrofuturism, right, from the perspective of African Americans in the United States, that is maybe one of the most absurd claims ever, because they live in a world where slavery was normal, where after slavery sharecropping and lynching for fun and, you know, just a good time on Saturday night was normal. They live in a world where half, the United States that's mostly white and privileged is just coming around to the idea that policing may have no other function but tormenting black communities, right? So from their perspective, the reality for which we find normal seems as alien as the weirdest sci-fi novel they've ever read. So part of what I think we have to come around to is that the body can adjust to just about anything. And if that's true, then the limits of what we think about as order are limitless, right? An order is not any particular order. It's just any given logic whereby something becomes regularized.
It can be just about anything. I mean, just as weird as you want. Yeah, I mean, as surreal and grotesque as, and
yeah, I mean, they're
and that there's no.
I mean, I'm trying to think of it.
Like, it'll just get. I mean,
yeah. For me, humans are just animals, right? And like, look at the different animal orders, right? There are species of bugs for which their entire sexual reproductive cycle involves crazy sex and then biting off the head of your partner. And there was never a point at which male praying mantises were like, like, I'm a praying mantis and I don't want my head bitten off, so let's get around that.
This is a little weird.
Right? This is so weird, right? I'm sure the first praying mantis that got their head bitten off was, for the 2 seconds they were still alive, like, oh, wow, this is weird. But it didn't destabilize the species order. Now, I'm not trying to say that humans and insects are self-same, but, right, nature doesn't seem to suggest there is any limit to how weird things can get, which doesn't mean that we don't need morality or we don't need ways of thinking about inventing new kinds of ethical orders. But it does mean that there's no hard wiring in us, right, which will protect us from becoming praying mantises. It means, in the true sense of freedom, it's up to us. So if we want to innovate a new ethical order for which torture isn't normal, or using whole black populations for free labor isn't normal, we can't rely on God. We can't rely on some kind of fundamental categorical imperative. We have to invent one. And we will be inventing it, right? The same way as, evolution invented the thumb or anything else. So it shouldn't surprise us then that North Korea could invent itself, right? I don't think there's a limit written into existence, right? We create it.
Is there a kind of ethics you ascribe to? I mean, if you don't like Kant, you don't sound like a utilitarian to me. I'm sorry if this is too sort of base level, but like, is this sort of alien virtue ethics, something like that?
I do like virtue ethics more than I like others. I mean, for me, boredom is as terrifying as cruelty. So, I mean, I think that, I vaguely fit into a kind of Spinozist or Deleuzian ethics where I want means of intensification and affiliation, the way that Walt Whitman thought about ethics, right? Multiplying which kinds of bodies can fit together and what kinds of intensifications happen. But what I don't think, and this is what makes me not Kantian, is that I can derive or deduce my ethics from human cognition. Meaning, I don't think that there is some groundwork for which I can say, oh, well, my ethics are just true, so that'll save the day. I think at best, my ethics are virtuous in that I can aspire to them, and I can try to aesthetically intervene in the world such that it might draw other people into them, or it may alter the conditions for possibility of them. But I'm working without a net, just like everybody else. And that's scarier, but for me, it's just, there's a fairly significant amount of realism in my cosmology, and so I just think that's what we're stuck with. So I like my aesthetics better, and I like my ethics better, but I don't have philosophical grounding to say that means that they're right. Is that helpful?
Sounds pretty neat.
What's that?
Definitely helpful. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Fairly neat.
Go ahead. Yeah, let me just say it since I already interrupted. So we have a new a student who actually signed up at the very last minute, Tim Rudiger, and he's coming in from the UK. I don't know if you could maybe introduce himself for a minute, and then we can.
Yeah.
Hey there. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Tim. I'm from Bournemouth University. I'm doing my PhD on the distribution of non-lethal weapons within the Middle East. Yeah. And I just started, and I'm just here in order to get some theoretical grounding in
Great.
general.
Yeah, no, non-lethal weapons are a big part of this story. So the idea that we could move crowds, shape crowds, right, alter crowds in various ways, and then call it non-lethal, right? For me, and we'll actually talk about this more, I think, the last week, but I don't think non-lethal weapons are about trying to minimize the number of people who die. I think it's actually about expanding the capacity of what weapons can do. So they might happen to kill fewer people, but that's not actually our interest. It's just that, we'd like bodies left over at the end to do something with. So cool, that sounds great. So just to catch you up a little bit, we're just sort of talking through, why the class is centered around horror and security. I'll say something right now. I'm hoping, I was going to kind of wait till the end, but now that we've got everybody, I would like the class to have a little bit more structure. I just figured the first day, not everybody would have done the reading and no one would be prepared, but I was hoping that from here on out, I think we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9 people, that 2 people could sign up for each, or 3 people rather, for the next 3 classes could sign up to kind of have a presentation of a series of questions and reflections on the reading, just to make sure we actually hear everybody's voice, and also get some more ideas into the mix. And I'd like to start the next meeting that way. So, you all can email, and if nobody emails, then I'll prod. But if 3 people could commit for the next meeting, to start off with just like, 5 to 10 minutes of kind of where you're coming from on the text, the major questions do you think the text raises, and ambivalences, problems, reactions you have to it. That would be great. And then it's not just me talking, and also it'll be kind of a little bit more hopefully diverse. Leanne, Mari, Mary, any ideas? Want to jump in? Matthew, we haven't, or also, I don't know, where's the other one? Gianni. Anybody else want to hop into the mess?
Yeah, I'd like to. It's Gianni here.
Gianni.
The faceless one, yeah? You've turned my whole thesis on its head, yeah? Thank you. Once again, every week it turns over. My whole premise for my thesis was around the sort of construction of unreasonable and irrational fear, in other words, social paranoia. I'm sort of fascinated with the disconnect that you begin to establish here. You talked about black sites and this whole area of creating a kind of a pure space of experimentation, yeah? And that area you talked about as sort of a looseness of security, yeah? Rather than being an absolute. And I was wondering if you sort of saw the position as that if the president said, enter this space and do what you will with it, with these people, then it is any connection back from the horror to a point of originally a sense of absolute, not horror but paranoia driving this. I'm asking this because I'm pushing a particular direction.
Sure.
I'm trying to establish a kind of connection for myself.
Yeah. There's this Zizek'ian line. God, I think he says it in Tearing with the Negative or Plague of Fantasies. I've forgotten where, but he says, the old line is, just because, how does this go? I don't want to screw this up. just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not following me, right? That's the old truism. But Zizek says the reverse is true too. Just because they're following me doesn't mean I'm not paranoid.
Yeah.
Which is another way of saying that paranoia I don't think actually corresponds all that well to the world, right? Precisely, paranoia is its own logic, right? And it has to do with certain kinds of anxiety and certain ways of forming loose connections, right, and seeing connections where they may or may not exist.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit different than the kind of meta-psychological question of saying, like, we have a state of paranoia, which is that because these connections seem more and more likely, because we have more and more knowledge, that we have something like what Plan C, which is this sort of group in the UK, is called a state of anxiety, right, where we're anxious all the time. Like there's something we should know and something we should be doing. And we have this kind of obligation to do it. And so that creates this kind of exhaustion, right? We're constantly not doing anything and worried that we're not getting enough done. And so I do think that at a mass psychological scale, we do have a kind of mass paranoia in that sense, and that I think people are anxious about what can happen, and that anxiety takes a lot of forms. Some of it takes the forms of denialism, so you have people who say, oh, there's no global warming, you know? And I think the majority of people say there's no global warming actually think there's global warming, they just don't think we can do shit about it, and they don't care. And then there's the other one, which is like, oh, we should be doing something all the time, right? So you get somebody like Naomi Klein, who's like every waking moment for 20 years was nothing but like going to every protest, being as politically involved as possible. And my favorite part of her most recent book is it's like the 6th chapter. She's like, I found out that was actually killing me. You know, I like wanted to have a kid, and my body couldn't support another form of life because of the toxic spaces I was spending so much time in, because I was on planes all the time, and I was exhausted in pursuit of transformation. And so the double tension of those two things, I think, is very palpable. Like, we either feel like if we're not saving the world, we're shit, or if we think we can save the world at all, we're shit. And those are the only two options we have. And that's bound to create some bonkers people. And so, you know, I don't want to create a theory of this, but I do think that Franco Berardi is onto something, that like a lot of mass shootings, this guy crashing a plane in the Alps, right, that some people just simply can't bear the tension any longer that something horrible is about to happen, which I think is actually the disavowal that something horrible is already happening, right? But it's the incommensurability of the constituent horror with the ability to adjust one's body to what you're going through every day. And so the example that I think of a lot is what it must be like to live in Baghdad and be exactly my age. So if you're exactly my age, I'm 37, and you grew up in Baghdad, then no less than 3 U.S. catastrophic events have been rained down on your head. The first, George Bush invaded and literally lit people on fire on streets, right? The burning of Basra. And then Clinton came to power, and he instituted no-fly zones and sanctions. And he killed, with sanctions alone, like 500,000 children, non-combatants. Not to mention all the people who were killed by so-called concrete bombs, right? And they were killed through starvation. They were killed through the return of diseases which had been destroyed, like cholera, and very simple diseases like dysentery. And then just when you thought you were done with watching your best friends die of diarrhea, we decide that we got to go in again. And don't worry, this time the United States is really going to impress you, right? Shock and awe. So if you are my age and you've grown up in Iraq, you've never remembered a time in which this thing called the United States was performing a series of lethal nationwide experiments on the people you think of as your people. You know no other reality, which means that there is an entire population in Iraq for which the worst, right, post-apocalyptic novel would seem tame.
Right.
So
I get
what
that.
the fuck is that, right? Like, what like, would you call someone in Iraq who has to worry about the sky falling on them paranoid? Or have we actually invented some new kind of mass psychosis, which must be being experienced in Iraq? I have no idea, right? Like, I don't even know how to begin to ask the question, but I know we have to ask the question because we've produced 30 years, right, of nation scale, right, alterations to a form of life. And I don't know what to call it, right? So paranoia, psychosis, just normal. What is that? I don't know.
Yeah, I get that, yeah.
There were some
I lived as a boy. I was quite young in under Pinochet.
Yeah.
For a couple of years was my family. So I get that.
Yeah.
Quite a deep level. So.
I don't get that. I mean, I grew up in Texas, which is weird in all kinds of ways, but it wasn't weird like that.
Yeah. But yeah. Thank you. I really, yeah. Good. I'll work with that. Okay.
I felt like there was somebody else who was trying to chime in.
Just a sort of anecdote. There was that teenage boy who was testifying from Iraq who was afraid of the sky, like blue sky was terrifying. Because of the drones, right? And I just shudder to think what life would be like. You can't go outside on a clear day without the horror of impending robotic death. Just, yeah, I mean, you're quite right. Like, what would you call that kind of neurosis, right? Especially society-wide, where it's so altered and so alien. It's mind-blowing to me. That was all. I just wanted. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I also want to stress, like, so there's this one on the left to say, oh, we've devastated that society, but what's also remarkable is that that becomes normal, which doesn't in any way assuage the guilt the United States has for creating it, but then, like, great literature, great art, lives, families, right? These things persist in spite of the intensity of that. So I don't also want to fully pathologize that life, right? So we have to run this really dangerous maneuver where we're like, that is a fucked up pathological form of life we've created, but not every individual in that form of life is pathological. Meaning people have learned to invent, right, to flourish, not in spite of, but precisely in that environment. And I don't actually think we have the vocabulary to talk about that. That doesn't either sort of like let the United States off the hook, right? Where we're like, oh, great, look, you wouldn't have all this great sci-fi and literature coming out of Iraq if we hadn't tormented you for 30 years. Or the reverse, which is, oh gosh, every Iraqi must be this broken, sniveling pile. And the reason why that second characterization is so dangerous is that is precisely the logic of colonialism that justifies the trusteeship of Iraq, right? It becomes a kind of alibi where, well, of course Iraqis can't rule themselves. They've had 30 years of chaos, right? So we'll have to manage their affairs for them. And breaking out of those, right, those two extremes, I think is the political task for critical scholarship, given, right, the experiment of Iraq is most of West Africa now. It's large portions of Central Asia and Afghanistan, and people who've lived under the U.S. involvement in Colombia, right? Like this form of life is not going to be so unusual. So we have to figure out how to talk about those things in that way.
And so, do you think there would be room then for, I don't know, I hesitate to say psychoanalysts, but like a new form of psychoanalyst to deal with this kind of, radically different set of neuroses without, just as you said, going into the sort of paternalistic colonial hegemony, that sort of thing. Like, is there a role for psychoanalysts here, or is that not even?
No, I mean, I think there's a role for something like the therapeutic. Like I've never given in to this idea that coping or coming up with therapeutic practices, which are by definition normalizing, right? They create a particular kind of normal, that we should like reject them out of hand. So I've always been really interested in the kinds of practices that happened at Laborde, where Guattari worked, where sometimes, you can't fix someone for being schizophrenic, but what you could do is create a new subject, right? So you don't create a new individual subject, you create a group subject. So you put a schizophrenic together with an OCD, you put an OCD and a schizophrenic together with a depressive, and you throw a manic in, and what you get is like this new collectivity that can do dishes, make food in the kitchen, keep each other going, work together, and that group subject, right, has a very different set of characteristics and plasticity than the individual subject. And I always thought that was a cool way of thinking about it, which is, rather than thinking about fixed or broken, think about what other kinds of affiliations and assemblages that one can make that might produce other kinds of forms of life, which, again, I think gets as close to ethics as I'm willing to get. And, I can imagine ways in which that could be valuable. The concern I would always have is that when we talk in terms of psychoanalysis, we often want a particular model of the psyche that can underwrite that. And this actually gets into a really important problem that I tried to get at in the Malibu piece, but is in general part of the difficulty of doing this research on neuroplasticity and on torture. What I don't want to do is the kind of reactionary Habermasian or reactionary Arendtian approach that says that this experimental neuroscience is all bullshit and it's evil, because precisely the reason it's so evil is that it works, right? Humans can actually be remade, right? We are not authentic selves, right? We are plastic selves, and we can be broken, we can be shaped, we can start over, right? Things can happen to us, which means that, yes, we lose some of the polemical edge of saying, oh, you're trying to do this thing and it doesn't actually work. What we need is, this like Kantian idea of the subject. But at the same time, I can imagine versions of cybernetic approaches to the self which aren't the horror of torture, right? So in some sense, what Guattari is doing in Laborde is a very psycho-cybernetic approach, right? It's what Gregory Bateson would call the ecology of the mind, right? Where you try to re-alter the environment such that new kinds of subjects and logics of individuation, right, which is what Simondon called them, right, processes which produce new subjects can come out of them. And so I can imagine more affirmative, interesting versions of that, which work by the same principles as torture, but aren't the same processes. Does that make sense? And so that the really terrifying thing about the insights of neurotorture is we might learn something from them that we want. And I don't think that we should have the kind of like prissy moral Victorianism that says because John Lilly was involved in torture research that we don't take seriously that LSD and ecstasy can be used to reformat subjectivity and produce different kinds of affiliations and attachments. Does that make sense? So right, I don't want to give experimentalism an intrinsically horrifying character. What I want is that experimentalism has no guard against horror. Does that make sense? Right? There's nothing to protect experimentalism from horror. But similarly, there's no guard against the horrifying experimentalism other than these other more interesting forms of experimentalism.
So I would like to pose a question here. Going back to your essay on page 26,
yeah.
you talk about let me see. Well, I'm going to quote here: pushing Deleuze via Malibu beyond Burroughs does not necessarily land us in the necessity of total control. Instead, it subtracts the human or human essence as well as interiority and exteriority from the presence of absence or absence of control. Is that kind of what you're referring to here? That there are like possibilities within this, let's say, framework where control is not necessary? Or are you talking about like a new, I don't know, this discovery is show us a new kind of paradigm where control is not a necessity but kind of a contingency. I don't know what to make of this
Well,
part.
yeah. So what I'm trying to say there is actually also what I'm trying to say with horror, which is that while it's true that there's no limit to what can be done, it's also true there's no limit to what can happen. So part of the reason why control, I think, requires some work is that once we realize that the universe isn't for us, that matter doesn't obey the rules that we want, that science doesn't actually, right, it doesn't have the capacity to order the universe, then control has a built-in limit, not necessarily a limit for good or a limit for evil or a limit for horror, but just that it can do other things, right? So I don't want there's a kind of sense where people try to read into control societies and Deleuze a kind of Adornian, right, like this kind of Theodore Adorno idea of instrumentalization, that what control is the perfection of disciplinary politics, whereby now states fundamentally control everything, right? Precisely the fact that, right, even though they're not the same people, but they're a set of practices, right, that Mujahideen becomes less Afghans, which becomes Al-Qaeda, which then totally fucks up U.S. empire, which then intervenes again and creates this other thing in Africa, and Boko Haram and ISIS come back, right, shows the limits to which, right, control can produce a final order, right? Instead, what I want to say is that once we get past this sort of anthropocentric presumption that control is only human control, then we realize that there are multiple orders contending with one another, right? And not all of them are human, right? Not all of them are ours. And that they will disrupt how that takes place, right? So, you know, classic example, climate change and capitalism, right? You know, there's like some version of climate change where Adorno is in his coffin and he's saying, see, capitalism did produce the limits to its own, you know, ... But of course that's not true, right? Capitalism didn't produce its own limits. It may have produced the demise of the human species, or it may produce the demise of a certain kind of industrial or advanced society, but we have no idea what climate change will create, right? It'll become a new kind of order, which might accelerate adaptation, it may accelerate mutations, it may lead to new forms of life, it may totally eradicate the current kind of tropic structure of the Earth and start all over, right? We have no idea. And so the point is that totalization isn't possible because all of existence from human, right, all the way down, right, microbial, quantum, then all the way up, cosmic, and then quantum, is an open system. And so contingency is much more radical than simply things having a relationship to one another. It's the fact that, you know, all of existence could blink out of existence because there isn't actually symmetry to subatomic particles, or that everything could turn out otherwise because we had no idea where these experiments were going to lead. But because of that insight, we also can't read intentionality or value back into them, right? So for instance, what if one of these new torture experiments produced something which could radically alter human consciousness and make new forms of experimentation more interesting, i.e. LSD 25 or ecstasy? Does that then mean that John Lilly was a good guy doing experiments for the Department of Defense? No. Because there was no telos there, right? We don't track back the fact that LSD 25 emerged to mean that the experiments that created justify it, right? So there shouldn't be a kind of post hoc fallacy that because contingency happens, contingency is good or bad. It is merely that the entire cosmos is radically contingent, and we never know what will and can emerge. Does that clarify?
Yeah, pretty much. Thanks. So is there any relationship with that, let's say, embracing this kind of contingency of cosmos and of things with what many have with, I don't know, with more systemic, I would say, thinking about capitalism, about climate change, or about, for example, what McKenzie work now calls fanaticism instead of capitalism? You know, this system, this mode of production that has as its objective the total elimination of life and so on. Do you see any resemblance maybe between this kind of two strategies?
You know, a little bit. I also think there's some aversive tension. So, you know, part of the reason why I want that radical form of contingency is because I also want to get out of the conspiracist theory of mind control, that if mind control happened, it would work, right? The problem, though, is that in fanaticism, I see a similar sort of tendency towards totalization, right? That we could actually give a name to capital, right? That there was a particular thing that capitalism did. I think polemically that could be very valuable, and I think that's more of what Wark is trying to do. So when Wark talks about something like the metabolic rift, right? He's trying to say that there is in humanity something which produces an excess that the natural systems of order can't fully metabolize, and therefore, right, we're always going to create more harm. But that capitalism is a particular subset within that metabolic rift which seems to maximize destruction and death, right? It seems to amplify the rift as much as possible. I think that's fine, but I think that it still falls back in some sense on one of the things in Marx that I'm most uncomfortable with, which is something like species being, right? Which is there's a particular form of life that is human life, which produces a certain kind of practices and effects. And so, like, one of the ongoing arguments that I've had with Ken is that, you know, there are forms of life on this planet which aren't in any kind of state of metabolic rift any more than whales or dolphins or others. There are plenty of forms of life on this planet, from intensely poor individuals to indigenous communities to self-sufficient communities, that actually don't produce much of a rift at all, and for which capitalism hasn't entirely exhausted, right? I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about the rise of movements like Idle No More is that there are whole communities that have survived the greatest apocalypse in human history, which is like European invasion of the Americas, another 400 years of colonization, and then like 100 years of hyper-industrialization and technological advance. And, you know, that's pretty interesting and pretty cool. And so, you know, whether or not it is capitalist or non-capitalist isn't as interesting to me. What's interesting is that people have made a form of life that exceeds, right, these other kinds of forms. So, you know, why can I see that and not just dismiss it as false consciousness or dismiss it as like a relic or, you know, yada, yada, yada? It's because I don't think that systems are ever totalizing, right? So I'm not surprised to find that there are diversifications which exceed what the system is. And I think you actually don't see those if you take an overly systemic view of capital, right? So if we say that all capitalism is fanaticism, then we're never going to notice the fact that there are these excesses, right, which were indifferent to capitalization and that may survive it. Does that make sense, right? So I'm wary, right, not because I think systemic thinking isn't powerful, but because if we mistake system for a closed system, then we kind of turn everything into the same unit of analysis. Hey, did anybody actually get to the Lily readings? Were there some folks that got to look at the chapters? It's okay if you didn't. I'm not like calling you out. I'm just sort of curious if we could talk about meta-programming a little bit. That's fine. Yeah, I think that's okay. Well, I'm going to talk about it just a little. Lily was trying to figure out if there was like a base operating system in the human body. So the reason why he calls it meta-programming is that he wants to think about this distinction between hardware and software in the human, but he also wants to think of something like operating systems, meaning are there certain kinds of things in the body, right, in the neurobiological network, which if you erase them, there'd kind of be no coming back. Does that make sense? Like, you know, I don't know, like I don't keep up with programming anymore, but when I still used to program, like there were things like CMOS, right? Like there were things in DOS, which if they didn't exist, then DOS didn't know how to function, right? So the other software couldn't even boot up. And I actually think this is a really important both thematic, meaning metaphor, and actual finding, which is he's trying to figure out at base what makes the human brain produce the effect of what we call a mind. Meaning, right, what sort of conditions of possibility, very much in the way that Kant asks this question at the beginning of Critique of Pure Reason, right? What must exist whereby human cognition is possible? But rather as a process of transcendental inquiry in Kant, in Lilly, he thinks that empirical research can actually tell us a lot about how this happens. So I thought I could say a little bit about kind of the experiments he did and what those findings were. I don't know, maybe that'll be helpful for folks. We can start thinking about what that means. The reason why I think this is important is that it suggests that, you know, unlike the kind of distinction between the phenomenological and the noumenal world that Kant had, right, where the noumenal world by definition can't access certain kinds of a priori things, right? So in Kant, for those who are not like Kant nerds, there are certain things which must exist a priori before experience, because if they didn't, then experience wouldn't be possible, right? Conditions of possibility for human cognition. And the two most basic, which he calls schema, are the schema of time and the schema of space, right? Because if there wasn't already something to put things in sequence, then we couldn't experience time. And if there wasn't something like the sort of abstract notion of space, then there would be no way to sort of distribute exteriority, right, in a way that we could make sense of. And there are some others like judgment and other things. But the most important part of his notion of a priori is that if these schema could be touched, right, if the noumenal world, the things in itself, which we supposedly have no access to, could access us, then the whole system would fall apart. Right? He's got this whole logic for that. And I want to say that actually Lilly's experiments on metaprogramming show that those based sort of like operating procedures, those schema, can actually be hacked, right, through sensation. Meaning sensation isn't just mere appearance. It actually has direct access for the schema that make appearance and experience possible. Does that make sense? Kind of? Is everybody with me? So he thinks that there are these, Kant thinks that there are these metacognitive things which we have to have, which have to exist fully formed a priori before experience. Because if we didn't, the whole system would fall apart. And therefore experience, right, is just additive, right? It's just adding data to the system of sorting that pre-exists. What Lilly is trying to show is that that system of sorting itself can be accessed. It's not transcendental. It's very much hardwired into the brain. And that when you alter it, it actually alters the condition of possibility for experience. In addition to the fact that it sort of flips Kant on his head, it also does a lot of things for concepts like human freedom, right? Which even if we're not Kantians, we do presume we have some like proprietary relationship to, right? Like whatever concept of freedom we have, we don't think that somebody can alter whether or not we feel or don't feel free. It also messes with our conception of autonomy, and independent of the whole sort of like, you know, post-structuralist critique of the subject, the reality is even if we're good Derridians or Foucauldians, most of us feel pretty autonomous, right? Like, you know, I'm a pretty hardcore Foucauldian at some scale, and I don't honestly believe that like somebody else is pulling the levers. But if Lilly's work is true, other people can pull our levers, and they could actually pull them in such a way that we wouldn't know they were being pulled. And if we could weaponize, in some sense, Lilly's work, then it might actually be possible to produce a situation where what we desired had been programmed by something else. Maybe not by someone else, but maybe by something else. And for me, that's a catastrophe for liberalism, right? That's an apocalypse for liberalism that the theoretical insights of post-structuralism couldn't fully stage. Because post-structuralism could show us at the level of discourse why the logic of the subject as an autonomous being was logically inconsistent, but it couldn't describe the fact that independent of the way that norms shape us or certain discourses shape us, that somebody could systematize the programming of subjects whereby subjects could be made, right? So this guy Wilhelm Flusser says that this raises for him the fundamental problem of cybernetics, of who programs the programmers. And so for him, it was a kind of like infinite recursive loop. That the move from primary or first order cybernetics to second order cybernetics was an infinite regress because there was always some higher order. And for him, that this sort of meant that this cybernetics was logically inconsistent. For me, that logical inconsistency actually doesn't pragmatically matter. Because even if we don't know why the programmers or what programs the programmers, it doesn't mean that the programmers can't program us. And from the perspective of someone being programmed, that's a whole new scale of having to think about the problem of self-determination and freedom. Because it means we might not ourselves know what is and isn't being programmed. So I'll say a couple of things about the experiment. The major experiments that Lily did were what are called sensory deprivation experiments, which are different ways to cut off the flow of datum from your eyes, your skin, your ears, into the brain. Now, if Kant's right, cutting those things off is just like a break, right? Because our schema are inside us. They are not dependent, right, on those sensory experiences. In fact, they're a priori, right? They come before them. And so they should just kind of go into, like, you know, when like Data on Star Trek like pushed the button and kind of went into like standby mode, right? We should just sort of hang out and be in standby. And that was a possibility. They thought that might happen. They thought that people might just sort of go into what was like the equivalent of sleep and just stop functioning. That's actually not what happened. So some people actually had, so the first form, they basically wrapped people in this really soft clothing and cooled the room so that you couldn't feel yourself and like blotted out their eyes and their ears. And some people would freak out. They basically had like intense claustrophobia, or you can actually have the reverse, which is intense agoraphobia, which is like the feeling of falling in too big a space. But some people could kind of hang with it until they just sort of calmed down. And once they calmed down, they would just sit there for long periods of time. And so then they would take those off after, in some cases, hours. So the people who freaked out in the first couple of seconds, nothing really happened to them other than the fact they had a panic attack and they were like, I want out of this experiment. I want my $25 back. You know, think the opening scene in Ghostbusters with Peter Venkman. Quit shocking me, you asshole. You're just trying to get this girl's number. In this case, you know, they would take these things off after hours, and they would then interview people, and people wouldn't know where they were. It would take them a while to recalibrate, and in fact, the room itself would start moving. So the very spatial schema would change. They wouldn't know the distinction between themselves and the objects. They described what they called undulation, which is that the sensory visual experience seemed to move. Things moved on their own accord. They felt like they were moving. They also experienced intense hallucinations, often of colors, of sensations, and then, you know, other things. The problem with this level of experiment is that even though they'd seemed to block out most noise, there's actually bodily noise, right? You can hear your own body, and that actually helps ground what Merleau-Ponty called motility, right? The kind of like body-image relationship. And so Lily took it up a step and developed these things called sensory deprivation tanks, where basically they would float people in asper water, which is water with aspirin dissolved into it, so that you became numb, and then use various techniques so that you couldn't even hear your own body. And so you would just basically be floating in empty space. And again, people would freak out, but the ones who could stay in for a long time calmed down to such a point that their body stopped swimming or trying to tread water and twitched, but rhythmically, what we call a rhythmic jerk. And Lily actually described this as being nearly identical to the same thing that fetuses do in womb, right? That fetuses can experience some things, but that most of the time they just twitch. And that they would go on longer and longer, and that the hallucinations would stop, but when you took people out, the spatial temporal order was way, way, way more dislocated. So people couldn't walk, the room moved, they didn't know how long they had been in the tank, so the experience of time had actually been lost, right? And it's tough to say exactly what that experience is for the prolonged deprivation, but at the very least it suggests that very basic characteristics of what we call cognitive schema are not hardwired. They are themselves plastic and have to be reinforced by pretty constant experience. And this, this sort of blew the doors open for what people thought you could do to people. I know it sounds weird, but immediately the first thing they thought is like, oh, cool, well then maybe we could reformat other things, like people's personalities, their identities. And this research started being combined with other research that had been taken from prisoners of war, particularly U.S. prisoners of war, from the Korean War, who had been imprisoned in China, where China had used, yeah, it is like being online too long, right? You start to, like, if anybody's done long-term gaming, right, this can also have these kinds of weird, like, sensory effects. China had tried similar things where they wouldn't deprive you of your senses, but they would deprive you of sociality. And so they would basically put you in solitary confinement, which we all know now is like basically a form of torture. People in solitary confinement in the United States have extreme psychological damage from it. But China would do this to, say, an American prisoner or even a Chinese dissident during the Korean War. And then after they'd basically broken, they were desperate for sociality, they would put them in a managed social experience. So rather than just reintroducing them to other prisoners, they would introduce them to basically what were actors who were pretending to be prisoners who had good ideology, right? Like who, like, knew the communists, sort of like what it was to be a good communist. And what they found was that the body was so desperate for socialization that there was no resistance at all to any idea, right? That it wasn't rationality which like says, ooh, is this idea of communism good or bad? But instead that sociality, right, craved ideas as a form of relationality. And in these moments they could basically steer or reformat what kind of sociality people re-emerged into. And they could produce, in some sense, they thought, true believers, right? People who loved the particular version of Maoism that was being taught, not because they found it so persuasive, but because it actually formed the bedrock of what it meant to sort of emerge socially, right? A kind of social ontological hacking. And so the Department of Defense tried to combine these two things and figure out ways in which the kind of ability to mess with very basic schema in the brain could be combined with kind of reprogramming of ideology, senses of identification, affiliation, senses of, whether or not you were kind of, a true believer when it came to various American ideas. And the left had all sorts of paranoid theories about this during the 60s, and it gets back to the question of paranoia. The paranoia may have been right? We may have actually been trying to recreate new forms of social neurological production. We have no idea how far that research went. And my interest is not like, are there a bunch of brainwashed people walking around who like do our bidding? What's more interesting to me is, as a tool of governance, what does it say that rather than either punishing someone for being a dissident or persuading someone to be a nationalist, we want to get into the condition of possibility where one emerges as a dissident or a nationalist. And what does that mean for techniques of what we used to call disciplinary power, right? But disciplinary power doesn't quite work, right? Because think back to the way that Foucault thinks about the disciplinary subject, right? It's these capillaries of power where forms of subjection, right, press upon the body, and the body resists, it pushes back, right? And that torsion, right, back and forth between subjection and subjectification, out of that emerges a subject, right? But torsion, right, in a physical sense, presumes that there is, not quite in a Newtonian way, but at the very least there's two opposing forces, right? Or there's two, right, aversive forces to produce resistance, right? This suggests the possibility that one could access the body in subjectification in a way in which that metaphor of torsion and resistance doesn't hold. Which is not to say that Foucault is wrong, but that there may be analytics and tactics of power and production and subject making which don't follow that kind of Newtonian or energetic model and require something else very different. And, you know, on a very vast scale, it could be the reason why, you know, we get hungry when we see a bag of Doritos, even though, you know, I'm vegan and I think vegan Doritos are disgusting, but I still am like, God, nacho cheese Doritos. You know, all the way down to the fact that we can make people think that dogs are eating them even though they're in a pitch black room. Those things actually may be on a different kind of continuum than traditional disciplinary politics. And that we should see in those experiments that that material basis for those kinds of techniques aren't merely discourses. Right? And this is, for me, the point I'm trying to make in the article, is that the kind of traditional sort of Foucauldian approach would be to say, oh, okay, so what we're entering in is a new episteme of power, right? A new logic of power. As if the material conditions don't change, it's just the logics which organize them. And I want to say that actually these are different material processes whereby, yes, we are also having a kind of epistemic shift from the biopolitical disciplinary power to something like control societies, but we're also enabling techniques which weren't possible, not because of the epistemic difference, but because we were accessing the brain and subjectivity through persuasion, you know, confessionals, et cetera, as opposed to through deprivation tanks, affective forms of, you know, changing the color of advertisements, et cetera. Right? That this is a material condition shift as well, and let's not just call it an epistemic shift, because the episteme still puts it within the order of knowledge. And remember, folks, this is horrifying. Right? This is not just the order of knowledge. This is also the order of non-knowledge. It's the the world of the creeping goo of your pink brain and the weird realm of deprivation tanks. And that's not biopower, right? Now, that may be happening. It may be contributing to biopolitics. It may help shore up certain kinds of biopolitical contradictions. But the thing I really want to insist upon is that is not biopower. It's not primarily about productivity. It's not primarily epistemic. And it's not primarily about the population or the body. It's about the conditions of possibility whereby life changes, emerges, and becomes cognizant of itself, which I think is not entirely distinct, but is certainly unique. Yes. That's the question. What is Conatus opposing? I don't know. That's the, so, you know, Mari just quoted me back to myself, which is always weird, because it doesn't look like me, which is not weird bad. Do it all you want. I'm just saying, like, you know, I was on a lot of medication for migraines when I was writing that piece, and so I actually don't remember large portions of writing it. And also, it's just weird to hear yourself. But, you know, it's hard for us not to talk in terms of resistance, right? So even when we talk about the conatus, right, in Deleuze or Spinoza, what we mean is that something tries to persist in itself, right? This is the framework or bedrock of what Spinoza thinks is a kind of will to live, right, which becomes will to power in Nietzsche, right? It's this thing that's in all things to persist, right? But if persisting means persisting as a particular kind of organization, and that organization can be changed both inside and outside, and it can just break down, right? See Alzheimer's. Then it's like hard to even hold on to what would that thing, the conatus, be, right? Right? What would that kind of essential core that wants to persist be? And actually, I don't want to say it doesn't exist. I just want to say that even the conatus has to be evaluated in terms of what Deleuze and Guattari in the On the Refrain chapter say is the most important philosophical question, which is what holds things together, right? The reason why they even coined the term the refrain is because they're trying to figure out a logic of what holds things together, which doesn't fall back into essence or identity. And nothing shows us what bullshit essence and identity is quite like the fact that you can hack people's brains, right? That even the most intimate, seemingly authentic part, the who we are, right? That, to return to the X-Files example, we are not who we are, right? That for me is kind of at the heart of figuring out this new logic of power. We have like 12, 15 more minutes. Could we do some Q&A back and forth, talking, whatnot? Anybody feeling chatty after all that? Don't make me hack your brains.
I have a question about something you said earlier.
Sure.
So you said something changes in the 50s and 60s with regards to security. But I'm kind of wondering if you don't see a continuity between the experimentation that was happening prior to this time. Is the change just that there was technological advancement, that we were able to hack better? I mean, because nationalism,
Sure.
you know, yellow journalism, stuff like this is a similar thing, but there's just greater technologies.
Yeah. I do think in this case there is, you know, I don't want to throw out discourse. There is something like an epistemic shift which I think kicks these questions into hyperdrive. So for sure, the ability of Napoleon to basically invent total war is only possible because of the vast technologies of nationalism after the French Revolution, which mean that when he says, you know, France, let's take this show on the road, people actually show up, right? But the degree to which we become self-conscious of how that can be engineered just makes a radical break in the 40s and 50s. And that radical break is really cybernetics, which is that people like Norbert Wiener, who actually was terrified about the ideas he'd come about doing, figured out a mathematical language to describe complex systems without having to model complex systems. So the major breakthrough of Norbert Wiener, the first mathematical thing that made him like a kid genius, was he figured out a way to mathematically describe Brownian motion. Brownian motion is the like weird wiggling that things do. Like you look at water molecules or really anything under a microscope and they just sort of wiggle. And the point is it's random movement, right? That's why we call it Brownian motion. So if it's random, by definition, you can't mathematically describe it. And Wiener's like, no, absolutely not. You can't predict what each molecule will wiggle, but you can describe the range of wiggling. So the example he uses is of a drunk person at a light pole. And he said, look, what I can mathematically describe to you is not where the drunk person will fall, right? The next drunk, weird, wobbly step they'll take. But within the field of light, sort of from the light pole, I can tell you the range with which a drunk person can stumble out, right? Meaning there are constraints to how far a drunk person can fall because of physics, and there are degrees about the structure of a drunk person, about how wobbling will happen. And what you can say is not the exact wobble, but what we call the threshold of wobbling, right? And then we can make particular kinds of mathematical inferences about having described that threshold. And that's actually what's called control systems theory in engineering, right? Which is like not knowing how much metal is going to expand in a particular moment, but knowing the tolerance limits of how much it can expand or contract before it, you know, explodes, right? Which is like one step across the physics line from thermodynamics. Now they start taking it up and like looking at more and more complex phenomena and thinking about like, okay, well, what kinds of control systems can we design and what kind of control systems can we intervene in? And they're like, well, if we can look at molecules that way, if we can look at animals that way, well, why not look at humans that way? And so very early on, political scientists like Carl Deutsch, who writes this book called The Nerves of Government, he just happens to be Norbert Wiener's next door neighbor, and so he gets interested in cybernetics much earlier because he's at MIT. Is thinking, well, okay, fine, we know how orders work, we can model orders, and we can steer orders, right? We can intervene, and we know what the tolerance limits of that intervention are, right? Let's start thinking of governance that way. And he's actually not malicious about it, but just the idea that we become conscious not only of ourselves, but of ourselves and then of our polities as a system of layered systems, right? Which even if they can't be modeled in real time, can still be described in a way that we might think of as rational or mathematical. And then therefore can also be thought of as things we can intervene in, right? So if we see them as a set of variables, right, an inexhaustible set of variables, but a set of variables nonetheless, then we can think about intervention as happening on a very, very different scale. And so that move from first-order cybernetics to second-order cybernetics, which is to say when we become aware of our own awareness, right, changes how we can do research. So I don't think we would have even thought about how to do neurotorture until we had come to understand that the brain itself was a system of systems with particular kinds of orders, which could be set and reset. So just to use another quick example, John Ashby, who was another one of the cyberneticists, roughly of the same generation of Norbert Wiener, wrote this book called The Cybernetics of the Brain. And he was a psychologist, and he was using shock treatment to treat people with schizophrenia. And what he was noticing is that there were a series of alpha and beta waves which were common to schizophrenics and people with bipolar disorder, and that they were different wavelengths than people who didn't experience manic depression or didn't experience cybernetics. And he didn't know exactly why, right? Meaning the brain was still what we call a black box. But what he did know is that when you shocked the brain, it sort of like shooting, the cue ball on a billiard table, knocked all the balls around, and when the chaos sort of resettled, a new order was present. And he thought that if he could kind of like hit the billiard balls enough times, that he might create a new order, and that would mean you would have a different kind of brain functionality and different kinds of symptoms. And the reality is, like, it was cruel and it was horrifying and it should have never happened. But shock treatment works in the sense that it does alter the condition of possibility for the subject that emerges from it. And he didn't exactly understand why, but the inside of cybernetics, like Norbert Wiener, is he didn't have to understand why to influence a system. All he had to know was that there was a system, and then when we altered it, that we could then look at how we had altered it, draw a distinction between system 1 and system 2, and then describe the effects and compare them. Right? And so that led to a kind of experimental view of neuropsychology where you do a shock treatment, right? You have a really rich description of the patient before the shock treatment and a really rich description after the shock treatment. You say, how do you feel? And you try to describe, right, what that difference is. And again, like if we hadn't thought about people, right, in the Kantian sense, like you shock a person, they may choose not to do the crazy thing afterwards because they fear the pain of the shock. But in a Kantian sense, you couldn't expect that someone actually wouldn't know themselves as the self they were before the treatment. And that was actually starting to be something that we observed. Right? People were losing memories. People were changing behavior and function. People were experiencing joy. Some people were experiencing profound depression. Right? So we were actually like tuning the knobs of cognition.
We got a question from Gianni about new power and neuroplasticity. So I don't know if you want to say anything about Malibu or plasticity or anything like that.
Sure. Yeah. So I was interested in plasticity before I was interested in Malibu, mostly because she was writing about it in French, and I'm a barbarian and I can't read French. So I started looking at neuroplasticity, and particularly the way that it was being used in education techniques and others. And then I got really interested because of Malibu's book, The Ontology of the Accident, because of one of my dissertation advisors, a guy named William Conley, had written this book called Biopolitics. And so I started looking at neuroplasticity, and particularly the way that it was being used in education techniques and others. And then I got really interested because of Malibu's book, The Ontology of the Accident, which she added something which was in Conley's reading of neuropolitics, but wasn't made as explicit. So in neuropolitics, Conley talks about the fact that his father had had this traumatic brain injury, and he realized his father had actually lost something of who he was, right? It wasn't just that like the damage was like in the way and his authentic self was like trapped trying to get out. He'd actually lost it. In the ontology of the accident, Malibu takes that a step further and says, look, that means the entirety of who we are is contingent radically upon a series of biological processes which can change, come to a grinding halt, be affected by drugs, be affected by car accidents, you know, any number of different things. And so plasticity is not just plasticity as having actually used plastique. I don't think she understands that it's not actually plastic. But what she means by it is it's explosive, right? That it doesn't, it's not just this image of like slow, it's also destructive plasticity, or what she calls explosive plasticity. And she uses the metaphor of plastique, which I don't love because having actually used plastique, I don't think she understands that it's not actually plastic. But what she means by it is it's explosive, right? That it doesn't, it's not just this image of like slow shifting, right? It's that the entire system can fall apart all at once. It can kind of out of nowhere, out of itself, right? Explode. And so, you know, I took your question about new power to mean the new sphere, which is a way of thinking about like informatics as being a field of power. And I think this is part of that, but this isn't cognitive capitalism that I'm describing, right? This is related, right? This is why cognitive capitalism is so powerful. This is why new marketing schemes watch your eye movements rather than using focus groups. But it's also something else, which is that the actual materiality of the phenomena we call the mind can be altered self-consciously, and also it alters itself, right? And that's the Malibuian, right, insight, which is that plasticity is to ask the hard question of what a brain is, and a brain is something that both can be changed and can change itself, and that's a really hard concept to wrap our mind around. But it is analogous in a metonymic sense to what Foucault means by resistance. It just doesn't work by the property of energetics, meaning there may be things in the brain that push back, but they don't push back, they actually multiply or alter or mutate. And those mutations may not be exactly a one-to-one result of how the torture or the form of intervention hoped that it would create it, but it also isn't a pushing back, right? It's a alteration or mutation. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? So plasticity may be
Totally.
You know, like kind of parallelism to resistance, but it isn't resistance.
Yeah, I suspected that. Thank you. Good.
Sorry, I didn't realize my cell phone was on. I'm finding it and shutting it off. All right. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here. It's 3:30 here, but I live on a Pacific island where nothing works on time. So, is it? I have no idea. Jason, how are we doing on schedule?
We're exactly at the end.
Okay.
But I mean, it's fine to go a few minutes longer if there's, you know, if there's a desire to, and it matches your schedule too.
Sure. Yeah, I have a few more minutes. I mean, if there's like a kind of like last minute question somebody wants to get out so they don't forget it, or if you have practical questions about kind of how we're moving forward. I just want to remind everybody, I need people to volunteer to present on the readings so that it's not just me spouting off the whole time.
I can volunteer for next week.
Who said that? Sorry.
That was Matthew.
Okay, Matthew, that'd be great. We need
I'd like to too, because I'm not going to be here the following too.
Okay, so we have Matthew and Jack. Ah, third?
I will as well, if that's all right.
Okay. Thomas. All right, we've got three. So you have the ability to contact one another, coordinate between you. You know, like there doesn't have to be a lot of coordination, overlapping a little bit. It's not a huge deal. But you know, just you might think about how you want to divide up their readings. Cool. All right. Thank you all for my first video pedagogy experience.
Amazing.
And we'll talk next week. And the other Grove, who is also thinking about this mostly at the population scale, she'll be showing up next week. We'll kind of be sort of batting things back and forth. No. Slow cooking is just fine. It's the first week. I still can't believe you're in Victoria. The only city I've ever lived in where there were at least 3 restaurants with the word corral in them.
At least 3. I don't think that's changed.
No.
I'd like to do the Shama Yu reading, Manhunts, if I
can everybody email me those readings? That way I can just like throw the list up on, because it's a little hard for me to do it right here.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, well, ciao.
All right, I have to go pick up my kids.
You can also divide it up in the Facebook chat.
Yeah. Either one's great. Nice to meet all of you.
Charles.
Thank you.
Bye.
Mary, hopefully you were either sufficiently impressed or you have something else to do. Bye.
Bye-bye.